I'm over here from our London office. We have 4 offices around the world: Hong Kong, Thailand, London, and San Francisco. Just to start off with, Sten isn't here to do his usual spiel about what we do, so I'm going to do my best to fill in for him. So probably the half that said they knew about what we do is probably more along the teleport lines than the Move Guys lines. So I'm just going to try and bring a bit of life to everything about and why we came together as 2 companies. So we basically have the same mission. You know, you'll see it on the teleport t-shirts that, you know, free people move. Move Guides has the same vision that everyone, you know, is going to move around the world and work. It's very rare that you're going to be able to get the talent in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, or whatever it is, to work where you need the people. People are going to have to move around the world to be able to work. Now that comes with a whole variation of challenges. The teleport guys did a fantastic job at generating content and giving people real insight into where they're going to move next. Everything they wanted to know about that city. We kind of tackled it from the slightly different angle of the enterprise side of things, looking at more of the HR side of the thing. So the challenge really around that is managing the cost, getting the best experience for the employee. And then there's a whole raft of stuff that you don't necessarily think of that until you really get into the mix of it, like tax, where you're getting paid and all this other stuff that's actually really complex business logic. And we kind of take care of that. We're the first platform to do it. So we've learned a lot doing it, and some of those lessons I'm going to share now. And I guess that's kind of it. We're going to do some breaks in between the sessions, so feel free to either interrupt me as we go, I'm okay with that, or ask questions at the end or when we break out. So I've kind of just been through what both our mission statements are. So it's about moving people around the world. So I'm not going to dwell on that too much. But I'm going to start by talking about, I do a lot of books when I do presentations because I'm a very big reader and I like to see what other people are thinking. And these 3 people probably, along with Jeff Bezos, probably epitomize the startup big growth atmosphere. You know, the first 2, Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, they were insanely passionate and insanely driven towards their goal. But they're on the very consumer end of the business, you know, when they started, both of them. Elon not so much now, but definitely when he started. And then you look at the other end of the spectrum, this enterprise end of the spectrum. You know, you got the Mark Benioff has obviously started Salesforce, and kind of Jeff Bezos who kind of sits in between them. But the key differences is this driven passion versus the Benioff sort of situation where you're listening to your customers, you're reacting to your customers. It's not the same, and I don't want to put this down, but it's not the same level of innovation. You're actually trying to fill a hole. Now what we've luckily done is we've found that hole and we're filling that hole. We're not anticipating yet what our customers would want next. And that's the key difference when you're going into enterprise, I think. When you're first starting, you've got to think about the hole, find the hole. Whereas on the consumer end, you can kind of think about really wild innovations and really think about what a customer might want and what a general public might want. So, and a lot of this is leading up to something, but when I think about this, I think about the difference in barriers. So when you're thinking selling to an enterprise versus selling to us, the general public, you know, if I wanted to swap between something like Spotify and Apple Music, I can pretty much do that overnight. Enterprise software is not the same. They choose a contract, you've got really long sales cycles, so you have to really be prepared for that and think about things in a different way. When you're not only dealing with enterprise software, but you're dealing with it from a startup point of view, especially a startup that no one's heard of, you're doing it for the first time, no one's ever done it before, there is a lot of barriers. People are scared to choose you. You know, they have to have a reason to choose you. These guys are gonna either make it or break their careers based on choosing your software. So you have to really appreciate where they're coming from, the risk that they're taking in choosing your software. So if you can think about that and you can get behind that, then it makes the whole rest of the process a lot easier. And you can really empathize with that person and try and help them along and try and help them as much as you can by convincing their peers, their boss, the people that are signing off that big check at the end of the process. Now, in all of that, obviously, as I said, we're doing things for the first time. We're not the only ones that have done things for the first time. So you've got this transformational aspect to it. So when you're thinking about this, you have to kind of think in roughly 4-ish areas. Around the requirements, which is back to what I was saying earlier, around what are we selling and why are we selling it. The quality and legislation, legal, whatever you're trying to go into, there's probably going to be some implication there. And lastly, security. So the gap is always, what are you trying to do? What's the problem you're trying to solve? But when going into the enterprise world, even if you're inventing something for the very first time, you've got to look at it from a point of view of you're still competing with something. That could be a bunch of manual processes, a bunch of spreadsheets that are hanging around, whatever it is, you've got to compete with something there, and you've got to be better than that. So whatever it is, you've got to develop your product to be able to fit and fulfill that bunch of business processes, whatever it is that you're trying to fulfill. As much as consumer, I think software is a lot more innovative, and we do borrow from that, you have to then think of innovation on top of that. But you've got to get the parity first. Without the parity, you won't get your foot in front of the door. So there's a lot of people, and Elon Musk was one that kind of really sold this idea. You've got to fake it until you make it. You've really got to, there's a lot of being said in terms of salespeople going and selling PowerPoint presentations rather than real software. But there is the other side of that. You've got to get in the door somehow. So as an engineer, how do you prepare for that? How do you prepare for the sales guys not quite, selling what you have at the moment, selling what you might have in, say, a month's time or 2 months' time? And that's where you start to come in. And that's where your relationship with the salespeople, with the pre-sales people, whoever you've got access to, really comes down to it. And as much as I try and get the engineers as close to the customers as possible. The more you can understand their pain, the more you can understand what we're trying to achieve, the better chance you have in being able to adapt. Now, a lot of this is about starting off from nothing. There's a lot of buzz, I guess, in the industry at the moment around microservices. So, everyone going to this microservice architecture. And we're quite lucky in that we know a few people, and I've had the great opportunity to talk a lot with people that were right at the start of microservices, people like Adrian Cockcroft and people like that. And the biggest piece of advice they all gave is don't do it. Literally, like when you're starting, always start with a monolith. Unless you're 100% sure on your domain, you will get it wrong. And it'll actually cost you more to change and adapt the microservices than it does to do a quick hack or a quick change in a monolith. You have to choose the right point in your journey to really think, okay, we know the domain by now. We're actually fairly comfortable with the domain. Now let's start chopping it up. And I can do a whole talk just on that bit alone. But that's I think one of the biggest pieces of advice that I got given, and certainly, I would give to anyone else, is that really think about, it's very few areas in the world. Finance, I know, probably being the only one. There's a big bank startup in the UK at the moment that's going very big, and they started from day one with microservices. But they were quite lucky in the fact that they had a very locked finance domain. They managed to poach a lot of people from different banks, and they started off from day one. That's a very rare case, I think. So just bear that in mind. But if you're going to have a big monolith, then obviously be prepared. Everyone knows the reasons why people change from monoliths to microservices. So you've got to be prepared for that tech debt. You've got to be prepared for that change of direction. So make sure that and try and keep the quality up. Try and maintain the boundaries, even though there might be loose boundaries, and try and keep that going while you're trying to really lock down your domains. And the quality constraints, I think, is an important part as well. I'm lucky in that every engineer I've ever worked with wants to ship quality software, and I fully behind that. But at the same time, you've got to know what's acceptable and what's not. And there's higher thresholds for some things and not higher thresholds for others. So getting that balance when you're 5 or 6 engineers in a basement is a really hard thing to master. And I think if anyone was going and starting a startup today, I would say try and give yourself a break now and again and think about what's really important and what's really gonna get you over that line and what's really can hold off for now. And I think security is probably up there on the stuff that can't hold off, but there's a lot of things that can. So this is where it comes to selling and getting through the door with these enterprises. What you've got to bear in mind is that we're on the cloud, and I'm sure a lot of you have either played with the cloud or are on the cloud already. Like, that's still a new thing to a lot of people, especially big enterprises. These are like slow-moving oil tankers. Just to do a course correction and do anything like that, it takes them a while to catch up. I've been to probably every single AWS conference for the last 8 years in London, and there's been the same message at the start every single time. They're trying to get these big companies onto the cloud. They're trying to encourage them with hybrid cloud and everything else like that. It's still slow, so you've got to really appreciate that and kind of bring them along with the journey with you. So as much as you can do, relate to what their systems are. And the next slide really, I think, goes through that a bit as well. Be prepared for tech due diligence. That's probably one of the most painful processes that anyone can go through. They're usually spreadsheets or documents that are at least 100 questions that are relatively boring, and I'm sure that at least they repeat the same question in various different forms 7 or 8 times just to try and trick you. But just be prepared for that and get your thoughts and get your materials together a lot earlier on. A lot of the stuff you'll go through is a lot around process more than anything else. This is the biggest thing on security, right? These are probably 2 of the biggest high-profile hacks recently. No one wants this, and I can't mention it enough. Right? If anything's going to slip on quality, security can't be the thing that's going to slip. It's also one of the biggest things that's going to be a barrier selling to enterprise, from a process point of view, as well as a technology point of view. You have to kind of appreciate and have I guess a healthy sense of paranoia. There's only one thing that'll ever keep me up at night, being in charge of the whole thing, and that's security. That's the only thing. And I always try and, when guys are pitching new ideas or anything, I'm like, well, what's the worst that can happen? It sounds like a very pessimistic point of view, but actually, once you ask that question, you can get beyond it very quickly, and you can get to the good, stuff that the fun toys that everyone wants to play with. But if you ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen, you can usually get beyond it pretty quickly. Try and use monitoring to your advantage. I've got a big section on monitoring coming up, but there's a lot of different platforms, a lot of different tools, a lot of different ways of monitoring. You've got to get rid of the noise and actually monitor the things that really make the difference. So that's the biggest thing that I would consider. And try and secure everything by default. Now, it was interesting, the pie chart earlier on with the different languages. In Java, that's a lot easier than I would say with the other 2 languages. Java, there's fantastic things like Spring Boot, where you get nice things out of the box. They're already turned on for you, and you don't really need to do much. So if I was to encourage anything, I'd definitely encourage trying to find things that make sense, that would just work out of the box, that you don't have to do much to. Having said that, We actually have all 3 languages on that slide as well, right? So as long as you know what you're doing, I think it's fine. So when I said earlier on, try and relate to something that people know, right? And as much of getting past these enterprise people, getting past their InfoSec questionnaires and all the rest of it, is about listening to them and empathizing with them. They all know this network layout, right? They all know it off the bat because they've been dealing with it for years. The closer that you can get to it, the better you are. So don't try and pick your battles, and don't try and be too different for being different's sake. You know, choose the technologies that make the most sense for the problem you're trying to solve. Don't try and like reinvent the wheel. When there's something there, use it. The second point about keeping as much private as you can, that basically is that public part of the network, it wants to be as light as possible. The more you can keep in your private network, the better. And that actually includes other software that you might be running. So anything from monitoring to reporting or anything else like that, the more and more that you can put inside that and keep it closed off, the better. It gets you through a lot of these questionnaires or a lot of these barriers very quickly, because your attack surface is instantly reduced, so it doesn't have to be open to the public. So when you've often got a choice about a particular bit of software that you might want to use, and you have the choice of maybe running it in-house or having it run for you, unfortunately you are going to have to sometimes run it in-house. Anything that's potentially has sensitive data in it or anything else like that, or could have, you might have to make that decision to put it in-house. It sounds like a pain, but a lot of them are actually pretty good these days, and you can package them up and put them on Amazon, and just put them in the private stuff, and it doesn't really matter, and it's all okay. It's actually that much more effort for you to host it rather than have it hosted for you. It reduces a lot of pain, believe me. But then, obviously, you want to open up your APIs, right? You want developers to use them. You want to integrate with your third parties, with your customers and everything else. This is where choosing a right API gateway is probably your best investment that year almost. Research, go through it, look at all the different gateway options, figure out what's right for you, lock it down with OAuth, the standard stuff, and everything will be fine. I'm not saying, you know, everything will be fine, but it'll be fine in terms of you'll get through a lot more stuff than you would do otherwise. So this is just a quick sample of the things that we've found useful. I don't know if they'll be useful to you, but I'll certainly say they're definitely useful for us. So nearly, I think every tech questionnaire I've ever filled in has asked about intrusion detection systems, and we use an open source one called OSEC. It's actually really good. Even, you know, people don't necessarily appreciate some of the open source stuff that's out there, but it's really good and definitely worth a look for anyone. And there's a bunch of other different monitoring that we use throughout the system. Anything from rollbar, looking for errors, and Logstash, and going everything over. We try and get as much information as we can, get rid of the noise, and actually focus on what's important. And getting that balance, I said earlier, is really hard. The best way we've found to do it is to get it into Datadog, summarize it, get it at a very high level, but then also have everything else as a backup. So everything else is still there behind the scenes. Just get it as summaries as quickly as you can, and actually work on the stuff that really matters. So how do you get through all of that? Now, I'm a great believer, and it's probably another talk that I could do, is just on what we call engineers versus programmers. It's this, and Joel Spotsky, I think that's how you say it, you know, one of the sort of almost godfathers of the internet, you know, very big guy, did Stack Overflow and all the other stuff, but he's very much, and if you read this book, he's very much a believer in everyone owning and really knowing the underlying principles of everything. He would often ask weird questions in interviews about, bit shifting to find a particular solution to something. Really low-level stuff. Now, I probably agree with 60% of what he says, but this is something that we totally agree on. I'm a big believer in hiring engineers rather than specific programmers. You do need specialists, don't get me wrong. Everyone needs that go-to person that will know the ins and outs of the real nuances of Spring or whatever it is, particular framework that you're using. You need a few of those people in your team. But you also need people that can pick up any language, know the fundamentals of how everything works, right from all of the stack, can muck around with SSH and all these other things. So getting that balance in a team, I think, helps you choose the right tools, helps you get through a lot of this stuff. Because we're in HR software, it means that we have to have quite a lot of personal information in our platform. And that means dealing with quite a lot of legislation as well. So obviously there's the Data Protection Act at the moment, but that's been canned for GDPR coming out next year. So a lot of the things that I have to think about on a day-to-day basis is, how do I fulfill this legislation? How do I have all the processes? How do I make sure that all of the engineers are trained and I have a register of who's been trained on what and when and everything else? There's a lot to think about when it comes to actually getting that paperwork done. That's just, you feel like you shouldn't have to do as an engineer, but you really do. And you have to kind of put that to 10% of your time. Just put it to the side and try to keep on top of it and trying to make sure that you stay up to date with every bit of legislation that's coming up. Customers don't like personal information going out, surprisingly, because of things like Equifax and Ashley Madison and all the other stuff. People can get hacked. They don't want their employees' information or whatever it is getting out there to the outside world. So it's a real convincing exercise, but it's also the fact that it goes back to my point earlier. When you're choosing partners, when you're choosing solutions, when you're choosing to develop, the more that you can keep inside your network, that makes everything a lot easier. When you're doing things like monitoring or tracking, even simple things like Google Analytics, just think about what are you putting in those tracking tags. The more that you can anonymize it, the lot easier life you'll have. The other thing that I would advise is, when you're going towards, which you probably will do if you're developing this from a monolith to microservices, keep all of the sensitive stuff separate. You're probably going to encrypt everything at rest anyway and do all the other stuff that you get for free on Amazon. But just being able to keep the PII, the personal identifiable information, out to one side makes it a lot easier for things like audits and everything else. They will go through that. They will go through your network layout. They will go through everything from your database layout all the way up. The smaller attack surface, the smaller surface that you can give for an auditor, the better. Most of the tech due diligence questionnaires are one massive checklist. A lot of the time you might be frustrated with the person on the other end. My biggest piece of advice would be, bear with it, be relaxed, don't worry about it too much. Also, don't bother trying to lie or get into some gray areas when it comes to these questionnaires. You'll be surprised about the amount of times that we've said we don't do something and I've still got the deal done. They might ask you to do it next month, next year, or whatever it is. They might ask to never do it at all, and I might just accept the risk. But don't try and sort of beat the system or anything else like that. It's just not worth the pain. You can actually just get through it just by being honest and saying no. Most of the time they're going to be looking at ISO 27001, which is obviously the standard, but that really focuses a lot on process more than anything else, and documentation and everything else. There's actually very limited tech in that side of things. And when you're hosted on AWS, they'll ask a lot for the SOC reports, but they're publicly available. So that's another free thing you get with AWS. Just point them in that direction and everything instantly gets happier and resolved, which is the nice thing about it. For the penetration and vulnerability tests, I would, obviously, you have to do them. You can't really not get away with doing them. But do them yourself, and then get a third party in. We were quite lucky earlier on. I'm from gambling originally, so I had a lot of PCI and all this other stuff that we did, and I had some good relationships with security people, and I brought them, with me, and we did a lot of this stuff earlier on. But getting that bit of paper that says, you've had an external third-party penetration test you and scan you is a great bit of paper to have. Again, well worth the investment. So, in terms of what I found useful, what I've been asked about in these things, and the sorts of conversations that I have with security teams and InfoSec and people like that, they will really go down to the minutest worth a bit of detail. They will ask us what IDE we use, whether it can automatically correct mistakes and everything else like that. So just being able to validate and talk about why you chose the particular IDE is a valuable thing. Sounds a bit trivial, but it's actually a pretty useful thing to be able to talk about. Packages and packager choice. So when I'm talking here, I'm talking about things like Maven and everything else like that. The point of that is, when you go again through a lot of these security things, you're going to be asked whether you use any particular open source libraries and their licenses. Certain, obviously, licenses imply that you should open source the entire bit of source code if you include those libraries in there. So you have to be really careful what libraries you choose to embed, and with Java that's hell. So make sure you choose something that you can maintain and you can keep a track of, and that you can actually make some good decisions on what libraries you do and don't use. They also ask about how you're doing code reviews and how you can make your things secure. So if you've got an InfoSec team, that's great, but a lot of the time they're looking for static analysis tools, why you've chosen that particular one, what the rules they're enforced. They will go down to this level of detail. And also, there's a lot of good stuff being done in security at the moment. So I'd actually encourage people looking at, especially some of the things like OWASP Zap that's out there, that's you can just run in Jenkins and automatically check your software for common security, OWASP top 10 side kind of things. On the server side, a lot of it's about process. So, what's your backup policy? What you're going to do if everything gets flooded? In that, being based in the cloud these days, we kind of just say, well, we'll fail over to another data center, and we'll all go down Starbucks and we'll work from there. It doesn't really matter. But again, that's about having the empathy and understanding about the particular customer you might be selling to might not be that up to speed with the cloud. So just make sure that you can cover all those. The last point on the server stuff is really about, so we practice Karma a lot. So you earn the trust, you get the permissions that you need to do, and you can go for it, especially on our development environments. Not so much the live ones, but especially the development ones. And I think there were two stories in the press over the last year that kind of epitomized the approach to Karma. There was one poor person he was a 22-year-old, 23-year-old kid, first job, been in the job 2 weeks, went on a server, did an RM minus RF star from the sort of slash, and everything went. CTO fired him on the spot. There was a lot in the press about this. He went on to LinkedIn. And he wrote this blog post. He was like, "Well, I've really screwed up," and everything else like this. There was a massive amount of support for this kid, because you shouldn't have that. A fresh newbie in that situation doing those they shouldn't have that power to make those mistakes. And Amazon, unfortunately, had a very similar situation, where they managed to take down literally half of the internet by fudging one of their S3 buckets in a particular way. And it just turned out that, again, a fairly junior level person was working through a playbook and copied and pasted half of the command. And it managed to take down, as I said, like half of the internet that ran off of the East Coast availability zone. The first thing that Amazon did is said, sorry, that's our fault. You know, we should have, have put a better process in place. That particular command line tool that person was using was then updated, so it couldn't do that. And this was all within 12 hours. They fessed up to the whole thing, and it's about taking that ownership over your employees and making sure that, you know, you're not putting them in situations where they shouldn't be. You're not giving it, you know, not the right tools to do the right job. And in terms of what it means for integrations, literally, I think the last 5 or 6 customers that we put through have all asked for this within 5 minutes of having a phone call. It's like, how do I securely log in my people to your software? So people expect this now. They expect, you know, everything to be SAML 2 compatible. They expect single sign-on. They expect certain things. So again, it's about listening, trying to find out what the expectations are. They expect a decent way to be able to get information, be it via the first load or the ongoing load through APIs or whatever. They expect that from day one. So make sure that you've got that planned. Make sure that you've got the APIs in place. That's probably, you know, a big thing that's driven everything over the last year for us. So, in summary, be prepared, listen. Listen to your team more than anything, you know, whether that's your engineering team, your sales team, whoever that is, listen to everyone, listen to your customer. Try and relate it to something you know, to something they know, especially when you're doing new things. And always don't try and reinvent the wheel. You know, there's a lot of software out there. There's AWS doing some great things. There's Google doing some great things. Don't try and build a security package yourself. You know, you probably hear it every conference you'll ever go to, but there's no real need. Try and choose the right thing for the right job and add value to where you really are adding value, and that's the business logic and everything else. So that's it. As a little starter from the lessons we've learned. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Sure.
Yep. You mentioned GDPR that's coming next year in May, and one of the things will be the right to be forgotten and data portability. So that probably affected you a lot.
Yeah. Right to be forgotten is a really interesting one. Because that, especially when it comes to enterprise, because you have to be able to clearly say who owns that data. And in GDPR, it's still actually unclear who owns the data. So if someone was to put your information into a system, do you own that data, or is the person who put that information into the system own your data? And that's where it comes to data processor versus data owner and these sorts of conversations that we're having and will continue to have probably until May next year when it actually all goes through. But there's a lot of work that we're doing behind the scenes to be prepared for, you know, whichever way it goes. Anything else?
What is your background? Are you more engineer or programmer?
I am very much in the engineering camp. I was lucky enough to join as I said, I went to gambling pretty much straight out of uni, and we tried every language, did a bit of this, bit of that, and learned a lot and trying different things. Everything was around choosing the right tool for the right job. Back then, Java was too slow, so we actually weirdly used a language called Tickle and wrapped it around C to get the scripting. A bit like, I guess, what Go's doing these days. We did things like our chat server was written in Erlang because that was the best thing at the time to write a chat server in. So, and we did a lot of different things, just choosing the right tool for the job, and knowing what the underlying structure and everything else was.
Do you use special tools to protect or monitor cloud application?
Yes and no. We rely a lot on AWS. AWS is pretty fantastic out of the box. You know, if you adhere to their best practices, you read all of the documentation, you have chats with their engineers, you can pretty much get it to do everything that you want it to do. We supplement it with things like OSEC HIDs and some other little bits and pieces around the edge. But actually, it does a lot what you need out of the box. They're adding, new features at an insane rate. My biggest, I guess, problem, if you want to say it like that, with AWS is typically when they do release features, they're not quite ready. So they're just trying to get that real MVP out there, get it used, see how people are using it, and so we use things like the WAF, the web application firewall, and things like that, in conjunction with our API gateway. So sometimes you have to just work around some of the newer stuff that's coming out, but they do a pretty good job.
Another question. So we asked on a registration form how you would write high-load startup, which technologies. So if I get everything you have done at both guides and started tomorrow, or maybe even today, what would you choose? So on the back end, what would you do on the front end? How you would deploy that? Discuss.
Sure. It's a really hard one for me because I think you get a lot of benefit from Java. There's so much stuff out of the box, but there are a lot of other languages that are catching up so fast to what it is. If you would have asked me that question 6 to 9 months ago, I would have probably said Python. I'm a big fan of Python. The biggest benefit I think you get from something like Python or any sort of more scripty type language is the speed in which you can write everything. I think when you're at an early stage startup, you're going to get so much wrong, it's insane. We got the amount of business logic and everything else we got wrong was just insane. You're constantly reiterating, going over, changing it, adapting it. Writing that sort of stuff in Java is actually quite cumbersome. So you do have to weigh up that, okay, we're getting all this good stuff for free in Java, but actually I just want to get this thing done. Other end of the spectrum with Python. I think there's a lot of good stuff going around in Go at the moment that actually starts to kind of give some of the free stuff that you get with Java over to Go. A lot of people are contributing libraries and everything else like that. I think, and we might start playing around with Kotlin, the IntelliJ language, because that kind of, it was like, to me, Kotlin seems like, back in a couple of years ago, I started playing with Jython, just as a kind of a hybrid mix of, okay, I can get all my free stuff that I get with Java, but I want to write it really quickly. Kotlin seems that kind of mix that we might be able to get to that nice balance.
And for the web?
For the
web.
For the front? I would probably choose, I mean, it's hard between React and Angular, right? Because I think they're both great frameworks. Me, as a hiring manager, hate React. There are too few React developers out there. Angular, a tenner penny. So that from a hiring manager's selfish point of view, definitely go Angular. I think probably React is a slightly better framework. So yeah, everyone learn React, and I'll be happy.
But React contradicts big deal with what you mentioned in your talk in terms of licensing. They had this thing going on in the internet.
I think that will be resolved. I think there's too much that actually uses React now. When it gets to that, like there was I think there was a court case in the 70s or something like that. That was, you know, can a generic vacuum cleaner be called Hoover? Because Hoover was that particular brand. It kind of reminds me of that particular thing. It's like it gets to a certain point where they can't really enforce that anymore, and I think that's what will happen with React. I think it's got to become more open and more, you know, usable out there. So yeah, I'm hoping that's, as I said, it's a slightly better framework. So I'm hoping that's the way it goes. But as I say, Angular is pretty good, and we're pretty happy with it. So you know.
That was a lot of great information you say for like people involved in startup, but mainly as I understand that's purely software related. Any extra advice you would have to add to all you have already said for the company which deals with hardware and software in startup? Looking back, what we are.
Dealing with hardware as well. I don't think. I think all the principles are still the same. I think, you know, empathy. You've got to realize the hole you're filling, why people want your software or hardware. Why do they want it? What does it give them as a benefit? And also, what are your constraints? You know, what doesn't it give them? What can it cause to go wrong? And I think as long as you have this empathy with your own stuff, I think it goes from everything from hardware to software. I think the biggest challenge I would say to anyone providing hardware at the moment is you've got a lot of competition from the cloud. You've got a lot, you know, AWS, Google, Azure, they're all doing fantastic stuff. And it's going to take something special now for people who's either starting something up or even going to a new project or whatever it is. A lot of these big enterprise companies are kind of, I wouldn't say giving in, but they're recognizing the fact that in order to retain talent, to get new talent, in order to be able to challenge and take the risks, they're actually almost spinning up mini startups within the big enterprise companies. So you still get this startup atmosphere. And I think these guys, when they're choosing to do something, they're choosing to do it in the cloud. So I think it's a really hard sell now. You have to be pretty specialized in what you're doing with hardware to actually, I think that's the biggest challenge for anyone supplying hardware these days, is having that the competition is much more fierce, I think.
I think that's it for the questions. Thank you, Steve, so much.
Thank you.
Now we have 10 to 15 minute break.